think I just did the entire introduction without unmuting my mic. I'm very sorry about that, but it works well. So thanks for letting me do it. Dave and Meg, you can go ahead and get started, and let's talk about this great
Can you hear that?
Thank you. You're up.
Okay. Somehow we lost Dave on this slide. He used to be on there, but anyway, in 2011, Dave and I met at a PFI field day, and we had both been pursuing raising grass-fed beef for about a year, and a year later we decided to get married, and that's when we started Troublesome Creek Cattle. And how do I go to that one?
Yep.
Okay. Oops. Okay, so the enterprises that we decided would work well for our land situation and our personal interests were grass-fed beef, outdoor pork, grass-fed lamb, and then honey and eggs on a small scale. So our grass-fed beef is actually kind of divided into two segments. We have our cow-calf enterprise and then our finishing enterprise. And right now our cow-calf enterprise is about 20 to 25 brood cows, and they're a mix of red, black Angus, red Devon, and some composites that I found in Missouri that were from a guy who had been line breeding grass-fed cattle for about 20 years. We like to see about 1,000 to 1,100 pound mature weight on them. Our finishing enterprise buys the wean calf from the cow-calf enterprise. Our target finishing weight is about 1,100 pounds, and right now we are direct marketing those as cuts, bundles, or bulk, quarters, halves, wholes. We have kind of a mix in our growing season. We have perennial pastures and we have annual pastures that are like sorghum, Sudan, millet, cowpeas, some fairly diverse mixes, and then our cover crops. And in the non-growing season, we'll graze the cows on non-GMO corn stalks. And then we also, this year, have tried some stockpiled forage and then hay, and we're hoping this year to try baleage for our finishing animals. Our pork, we played around with some red wattles and really liked them. We started out with one sow and tried outdoor farrowing and started kind of playing around with mixing our own rations and just seeing how that affected their performance. We sold all of our finished hogs and direct marketed those as cuts, halves, and wholes, and then sold our sow, and we are pigless right now while we kind of revamp things and try to figure out how to do it better the next time. We're hoping this year that maybe we can have more like 5 or 6 sows and try it on a little bit bigger scale. We also have grass-fed lamb, and right now this is a pretty small enterprise. We just have a small flock of Katahdins, and the main reasons why we chose them is because we could use them as a landscaping tool. They could utilize our brushy areas and some of the weeds and stuff that the cattle might not readily consume. And there also does seem to be a demand for them, so we plan to direct market those as cuts and wholes. And then before we met, David already had bees, so that was already somewhat established, and we have about 4 to 6 hives on average now, and that's been great to be able to sell that to our beef and pork customers. And then eggs, when we have a surplus, we sell them, and then that helps kind of justify the labor for our own laying flock. Some of the things that we would like to pursue in the future would maybe be hog production for Nyman Ranch. We have a neighbor who has a building that we think we could handle about 30 sows in. We would like to maybe try some pastured poultry, some chickens or turkeys, and raise those seasonally and be able to direct market those to our same customers that buy the beef and the pork. And then we're also hoping to grow some small grains, or field peas or whatever we might think we need for our livestock feed. And then we also would like to maybe try some corn and beans and maybe some perennial crops in the future, some fruit trees or nut trees or whatever might fit into our operation. Right now we own our acreage that's about 6 acres, and we run the sheep and head run the hogs on that. And we run about 14 acres across the road from us that this year we actually stockpiled and are grazing right now with some of our finishing animals. And then we have 10 acres of crop ground that this year we'll be renting from a neighbor, and we'll just be doing probably corn or beans. I'm not sure which corn. We'll do that this year. And then we're renting about 44 acres of both perennial and crop ground, perennial pasture and crop ground from my parents. Uh-oh. What?
Just mention
Oh, okay. Something that we've kind of found with the land base that we have right now is that it's an awful lot of labor, and we could increase our production with very little added labor if we could just increase our land base. So that's kind of one of the things right now that's holding us back a little bit. And that's about that. I think that's all we have, Luke.
Awesome. I'll bring up Ed's slides now. And I think I forgot to mention earlier that folks in the audience can ask questions throughout, try to hit them if they're timely and right on topic.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so leases, conservation, and beginning farmers, a lot of the stuff that Meg and Dave have mentioned, certainly issues for a lot of people. So we'll talk about some of the transition issues with family, as well as lease issues with conservation and kind of selling yourself as a beginning farmer, I guess, and then also specific lease provisions that are tailored for beginning farmers. So land tenure trends and opportunities, that's where you can kind of sell yourself perhaps. Very basics of lease contracts, incorporating conservation, and then tailoring for beginning farmers. So some of the opportunities, these are some of the statistics of Iowa from the survey that Mike Duffy does every 5 years, the Land Ownership and Tenure Survey in Iowa. Basically what it's showing here is that there is a great deal of rented land, and it's probably going to continue to grow, at least moderately, and that also more, the trend is movement away from the land of the owners. And so there's another opportunity to sell yourself, particularly if those social ties that dominate agricultural leases so predominantly are lessened. That provides opportunities for new farmers to get in. What's not listed here also is that the newest farm census came out, and it shows a further deterioration of the middle-sized family farm, and so that basically means fewer options for landowners. So if you can set yourself apart somehow, that can certainly be beneficial. And with grazing, and with purchases from recreation enthusiasts, if people buy it for hunting and fishing, that type of thing, grazing can certainly play a role in that. So lease basics. Leases are contracts, and as such, you can basically contract to whatever you would like to deal with. So if you want certain provisions in there, you can put anything you want into a contract as long as it has a legal purpose. And this, this means to be creative with the arrangements and why it suits the landowner as well as the farmer, but don't be creative with the language. A lot of the language within a lease and with legal documents in general is very specific, and it has a legal definition, and that's why it's important to at least have an attorney review the lease, even if you draft it. But at a very minimum, if it's for more than 1 year, it needs to be written in order to be enforceable. If it's for more than 5 years, it needs to be recorded in the county recorder's office. That's a statute in Iowa. But it's a good idea, even if it is for less than 5 years, that you still can record it. You don't have to, but you can, and it's a good idea in case the landowner sells the property, that type of thing. Your lease is protected that way. Identity of the parties. Need to know who's entering into the lease, the landowner and the farmer. The term or duration needs to be specified. A description of the property. Preferably, this will be a legal description. If you're dealing with a right of first refusal or an option to purchase, then it's very critical that it has a distinct legal description in order to be enforced. So I know a lot of beginning farmers, are interested in starting out leasing and then moving into an option to purchase. So if that's the case, a legal description of the property is a must. And finally, amount of rent. So those are the very basics to have a lease contract, but certainly there are many, many other characteristics of the arrangement that should be addressed. A quick word on legal documents and advisors. I talked about this a little bit, but in general, there are many lease variations as well as transition tools, and there's just as many, if not more, definitely more, landowner, farmer, family, and land variables to take into account. So matching those up is critical. So establishing your priorities and then going to an advisor is important. And again, I think legal advice is like an insurance policy. The picture there at the top may cost you a couple $100, but if you end up in a courtroom with a dispute, it's going to cost much, 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 much more. So treat it like an insurance policy. And I can't seem to, it just keeps adding. Okay. Okay, so the basics of a lease that addresses conservation, we'll go through some mandatory conservation provisions, but I think what's more critical probably is establishing a sustainable relationship. If the relationship isn't sustainable, if it doesn't benefit both parties, then it's not going to last very long, and it's not going to be good for either party or the land. So tenure security is one of the most important benefit or characteristics of a conservation-oriented lease. This can be particularly helpful for beginning farmers, but in essence, it provides the ability to plan, and then also allows greater opportunities to reap the benefits of conservation improvements, increases incentives for extending or renewing the lease, can increase access to land as well as capital for new farmers. So if you have that long-term security, certainly that's looks good as far as lenders are concerned. And it also increases the connection with the surrounding community, which can be important. And finally, reduce transaction costs and not having to deal with rent every year, renegotiating, that type of thing. And we'll look at ways to renegotiate or to adjust the rent without renegotiating. So with tenure security, the big concerns, there are several concerns of landowners that landowners have, reasons why they might not want to enter into a long-term lease. So one of the questions that's often posed is how can we encourage landowners to do that? One of the biggest concerns, obviously, is the lack of ability to renegotiate rent. Prices are all over the place. Land values are all over the place. So this is a legitimate concern. which can be addressed though traditionally through crop share arrangements. Those are becoming much less prevalent now. People, landowners prefer to get cash, which is fine. They don't want to market it, but there are flexible cash leases available, which can basically take the place of a crop share lease. So those base the rent each year on a predetermined price and yield. It could just be, price or yield. Really, I think it's best as far as a risk management tool to do price and yield. And there's a number of formulas that can be used for that. Those are on the Iowa State Ag Decision Maker. You can find those. Also, just establishing an index for annual rental adjustments, so it doesn't have to be based on the price of a specific commodity at a specific time or the yield. It can just be, based on average rent for your county or average rent for the state, however you want to set it up. And decrease in marketability. So there's a concern that if they enter into a long-term lease, they're not going to be able to sell the property. It's encumbered, which is true. There can be provisions for an early termination clause that basically says, that if the land is put up for sale, that the landowner can terminate, but under very set circumstances, and they may have to pay some type of damages. Consider an option to purchase for the tenant. So if they're worried about marketability and you are the market, that isn't as much of a problem. And again, it's very important to include an adequate legal description there. Fear of entering into a long-term lease with an untested tenant. So this is an important matter, particularly for entering into a lease with beginning farmers. But again, one of the most important things is that if the beginning farmer defaults, particularly on rental payment, then it's considered a default and the lease can be terminated. And so this is very important to provide kind of a protection in there, so a period to allow for cure, whether that's 30 days, 60 days, maybe even more, so that it's not too severe of a penalty. And then there's also alternatives. We'll talk more about these in a little bit, the cost sharing, risk sharing, mandatory alternatives. One of the big things here is, if they're not willing to enter into a long-term lease, you'll certainly want to talk about reimbursement for improvements that you've made. And if the lease is terminated before you've captured any of that investment, then you'll want provisions for that. We'll talk about that as well. So a couple of ways that you can add tenure security to a lease. Obviously, just having a longer lease term is beneficial, but you'll also want to address renewals or extensions. So if you have, say, an automatic renewal, say you have a 5-year lease, typically there's a set date for notice of termination. If notice isn't given by that set date, then which is usually about a year before, then the lease will continue on a year-to-year basis. That's the way it usually works. But you could set it up so that if notice of termination is not given by that date, then you have another 5 years or 3 years, whatever it may be. Now, a rolling lease term goes even further. So this is an instance where the lease is renewed every year for multiple years unless notice is provided within the first year. So let's say you have a 5-year lease, no notice, and it starts March 1st, goes through past the September 1st deadline for notice of termination. In that first year, you automatically have another 5 years. So every year you're getting that same security unless notice is given. And just a note here of caution for beginning farmers. I've heard a couple people ask before, if it's just, if the farmer can get out of the lease at any time, and that is not the case. These terms apply to both parties. Okay, so I mentioned earlier reimbursement for improvements. This is often found in leases for buildings, significant improvements, or even lime, but it can be used for soil improvements. And it's just a matter of incorporating that into the lease, establishing a base, and then some way of monitoring whether the soil is being improved. Okay, and then another question that often arises, particularly with kind of alternative agriculture and smaller niche markets, is what is included as permanent property or a part of the lease. So we've got a couple of pictures here. Fences are usually part of the property. So, if you improve the land with fences, that's going to stay with the property after the termination of the lease. Now, the top picture there, obviously, it's fencing, but it's more mobile, and so more likely to be considered property of the tenant, and probably the same with the little coop there. Okay, risk sharing is another primary consideration for a conservation-oriented lease. And basically it if the landlord shares the risk with the tenant, then it enables them to take on more risk, or at least perceived risk, with sustainable practices. So if you have a landowner that's particularly interested in cover crops or whatever conservation practice they'd like to engage in, if there's any type of risk or even just a perceived risk, like I said, they can share in the risk through a crop share lease, through flexible cash lease provisions, which we discussed earlier. And it is important to recognize that these can have an impact on Social Security, taxes, and estate planning. Basically, if you go into a crop share lease and you're sharing if the landowner is sharing in the management as well as the costs of the operation, they're more likely to be considered self-employed and actively engaged in farming, which can have a number of consequences there. So you'd want to talk to an attorney and potentially a tax planner as well. Cost sharing, so basically just making conservation practices less expensive. That can be done, again, it's common in crop share leases, but as leases are contracts, you can negotiate any arrangements that you would like to see. So in a sustainable arrangement, that might be fees or paperwork or just the processing involved in organic certification. Or it could be providing specialized equipment or custom labor for things that the farmer may not be familiar with yet. And then one of the simplest ways is just decreasing the rent for certain conservation practices. This, with a graduated rent, it would slowly increase over time as the risk of any decrease in yield is mitigated. Here's a couple of examples of ways to reduce the rent. So this first one is kind of the graduated rent that I was talking about. So you establish a rental amount and then reduce it by a certain percentage, and then each year it's increased until you're up to the full amount. Or you could just specify a set amount to reduce it by. Or on the bottom one down there, reduce the rent based on on-farm practices. And you'd have to come up with the amounts for these, what you determine the value to be on your own. Okay, so generally conservation provisions. These aren't necessarily conservation provisions, but they impact conservation. So Often the statement of purpose with a lease, an agricultural lease, is just that it's for farming purposes, and it'll often just say, that the farmer is allowed to use it for the production of crops or livestock, or maybe it just might say agricultural lease and be as simple as that. If the landowner and the farmer wish to recognize the long-term benefits of conservation and sustainability in the lease, it doesn't hurt to say that right up front, and that gives both parties greater evidence of the intent of the lease to begin with. The standard of husbandry, this gets closer to tying directly in with conservation. Almost all form leases that you'll find online, whether they're through extension or bar associations, will have these provisions. And often they state that the farmer will operate the land in a good and husband-like manner, something like that. They may talk a little bit about conservation, or they may focus more on productivity. These provisions have in general been interpreted as applying to both. So just saying good husbandry doesn't mean that there's a focus on preserving the soil or land assets. It could mean maximizing production, particularly in a crop share situation where the landowner's interest is also maximizing production, or at least it could be. So historically, those have cut both ways. If you want to have a provision that, again, focuses on conservation and provides, the court, if it should come to that, with evidence that that's the type of arrangement you've negotiated, then you can create a higher standard of husbandry, essentially, or one that focuses on conservation, such as this one here. These are some typical form lease or sample lease provisions that you'll find. These are important. These are adequate for certain practices or conservation concerns, but they may be incomplete for your priorities. So, the one there, abiding by all local, state, and federal rules and regulations. That sounds good, and it could even say, conservation regulations or environmental regulations. It doesn't necessarily mean much if there aren't regulations that are applicable to the farm operation. And the last one there is pretty significant. If you think that the NRCS conservation plan or a similar one developed would be adequate to cover all of your conservation concerns, then certainly incorporating a conservation plan into the lease would be beneficial. And it's also adjustable. Crop residue, I mentioned this one in particular just because of its significance and the fact that there is a statute on it in Iowa. So in Iowa, if the lease does not address crop residue, then it does belong to the farmer. Any above ground portion of the plant belongs to the farmer. And so if landowners do want to keep the residue on the land or use it for livestock, or if the farmer specifically recognizes the value of keeping the residue on the land, but also perhaps grazing it, then they may want to bring that up with their landowner and talk about a provision which addresses that and any limits of it that may be applicable. Okay, so some of the less typical conservation provisions: timing of manure application, use of mechanical or non-chemical means of control rather than chemicals, mowing of road ditches, so provisions that deal with wildlife preservation, livestock access to surface water. This can be addressed as well. Basically any conservation provision or any conservation concern that you can think of can be addressed within the lease. I can't emphasize enough that leases can be a very creative tool in dealing with any concerns that either party may have. Other methods other than the specific requirements or prohibitions, we talked about incorporating conservation plans, and you can have it set up where if you have a 5-year lease, every year or every other year you'll meet with NRCS district conservationist or another third party to go over the conservation plan and adapt it to new situations, new technology. Land use provisions. So you can have a table incorporated right into the lease establishing crop rotations or specifying which plants are to be, or which acres are to be planted to what in each year. It can be as in-depth as you want it to. Finally, you could just rely on certain thresholds and require soil testing, and if it falls below that, then obviously something needs to be done, and you can address it. You can have the consequences of that written into the lease. Okay, so a few beginning things that might be specific for beginning farmers. What are you renting and what are you doing on the property? So what is the type of property? If you're a beginning farmer that just has a couple of acres and a farmstead, and you're also renting the house, you need to perhaps be very specific about the purpose of the lease, and make sure that if your intention is that it's a farm lease, then that's specified. If it's not, and the primary purpose is not agricultural, and it's viewed as residential, this puts you under the residential statutes, under the Iowa residential landlord-tenant laws, which have much greater responsibilities put on the landowner for maintaining the buildings that are involved. On-farm marketing or processing. So again, making sure to state in the lease the intent, whether it's for farming or perhaps if it's more commercial. So that's what arises here, is if there's a greater amount of processing or retail marketing on the farm, then it could be viewed as a commercial lease rather than agricultural. So again, state the intent in the lease. The cost sharing and risk sharing provisions we talked about earlier in relation to conservation, those apply again to beginning farmer considerations. Reducing rent, particularly in the first few years, using that graduated rent to get the beginning farmer in there, and then they can slowly build up to paying full rent. Sharing equipment if it's a retired farmer or landowner that has equipment from, say, a spouse that was a farmer. Custom farming, this can be another way for beginning farmers to get started, particularly if they have equipment. So with the custom farming arrangement, it doesn't have that, even the upfront capital of having to pay rent. You're actually getting paid to do the farming, and the landowner receives the crop and markets it. Or you could start with that and then transition to a way or a method of paying the farmer with the crop, and then they can start learning marketing and that type of thing as well if they need to. And so really what that's getting at is kind of transitioning and using or replicating the farm career ladder. So if you start with custom farming, you're basically like a contractor or similar to an employee. You're not an employee, but it's a similar situation. Management decisions are largely made by the landowner, and the landowner bears the risk of decreased yields or crop failure, that type of thing. And then it can move into a lease where the new farmer is a tenant, and so now you're involved in more of the management decisions, and as well as the risk transitions. And so within this, there can be even more of a transition. So if you go from custom farming to a cash rent situation, or I'm sorry, from custom farming into a crop share lease, in which you kind of shared risk and management, then into a cash rent lease. So then the tenant is taking over more of the management control and risk of the operation, and then eventually, if everything works out, the new farmer can actually become the owner, and so that kind of replicates the farm career ladder that's existed for probably the last couple of centuries. Other beginning farmer considerations, very important in those situations. So, particularly with the custom farming and the crop share situation, in which the retired farmer or landowner is doing a great deal of mentoring and sharing responsibilities, to avoid the appearance of a partnership, unless you actually want a legal partnership, which in most cases the landowner and the farmer do not. So in order to do that, again, stating the intention of the relationship in writing, that it's a contract, that neither party can bind the other one to any debt or liability, keeping separate books, keeping separate profits, separate operational decision making, and finally, just not using the terms partner. People like to use the term partner, and it makes sense, but legally it has a very specific definition, and you want to avoid that if you don't want to take on the debts and liability of the other party. And finally, just keep records to provide evidence that you are not indeed in a partnership. So kind of the other portion of this presentation, family succession issues. One of the biggest things is determining, are you passing a business or are you passing land? They can be very different things. You can do both, of course, but you need to think about this. And if the family is passing a business and not just land, then they need to develop a farm succession plan as well as an estate plan, particularly if there are non-farming heirs involved. One of the biggest parts of this is simply prioritizing your goals before you ever go talk to an attorney or other advisor. Think about what your goals are. And for the farm business and the family, a lot of people, the first thing that they ask about in passing farm businesses or land are taxes and how to avoid taxes. I think that is something that needs to be addressed. It's a cost that needs to be minimized, but it's not really a goal. So if your primary goal is avoidance of taxes, then you can give the property to a charity and you've accomplished your goal. Another important aspect of this is fair versus equal with farm succession. This is particularly in relation to farming heirs and non-farming heirs. So parents always want to treat their kids equally, but it might not be the fair thing to do. So basically what needs to be evaluated is what contribution have those farming heirs given to the farm, and that should require additional compensation, and so therefore inheriting more of the farm business. There's a number of methods used to do this, and we can go into these if you guys have questions about them. But people often ask, what's the best way to transition the farm? And, should I put it in a trust? Should I put it in an LLC? And the answer is, of course, it depends. So there's a number of ways to do it. Probably what you'll come up with is that several of these tools will be used. So, you may start gifting equipment, that type of thing. Then you may eventually put the land into an LLC, something like that, or possibly do an installment sale contract. So there's a number of ways to do it, possibly multiple ways within the same farm succession plan. And finally, in all of this, it's probably going to be important particularly if there's off-farm heirs, to facilitate some way of getting liquid assets, so that land and buildings and the farm business assets aren't the only thing that you're passing on. So if you want to treat your kids fairly, perhaps, compensating the farming heir for their contribution through, succession of the farm business, but also providing life insurance or non-farming assets to those non-farming heirs. Another way to do this is having long-term care insurance that protects your assets from having to pay for nursing homes, those types of things. Selling off non-productive parcels or dividing the land that way. And I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm just saying these are options. Or putting buy-sell agreements into the LLC or C Corp, whatever it is, whatever method of transition you come up with. We've got a question there. Can I talk about the benefits for landowners of renting to beginning farmers? Iowa in particular has a tax credit for beginning farmers, and let's see, I believe it's now 7% for cash rent leases and 17% for crop share leases, and then they can get another additional 1% if it's rented to a military veteran. And I'll talk about all of the incentive programs for landowners in just a little bit. So one of the ways that I mentioned is an installment contract, and I think that Meg mentioned that they might be doing that with their parents. This can be a great way to transfer land, particularly if credit is hard to get a hold of. So it's basically seller financed, and the buying farmer provides installment payments in return for the land. It can also spread out capital gains tax, so you're still going to be taxed on the capital gains, but it spreads it out, and it also provides interest income every year because it is seller finance, so you're not going through a bank and they're not getting the interest. And now that interest income, this is another one of the beginning farmer incentives, can be tax exempt through the Iowa Beginning Farmer Loan Program, and that's federal and state taxes can be exempt. But it's also important to recognize the severe remedies in case of a default. So if the farmer misses or the buyer misses a payment, in Iowa, they have about 30 days, could be 60, sorry, to cure that. So to make that back payment, they have about 60 days. If that's not made, then the remedy is that the landowner gets the land back. So then the farmer has lost all of their equity. So very, very severe. Now on the upside, again, this is a contract just like the lease. And so, the default state law is that the landowner gets the land back, but they can contract to any provisions they like and override those state laws. Okay, so one of the things that we may want to talk about with the succession is if they do create a business entity, how non-farming heirs are dealt with in the farm business. I'm not saying it's bad to put them in there, but certainly one of the options is to provide an inheritance for the non-farming heirs in another way, such as proceeds of a life insurance policy, non-farming assets, that type of thing. And I should add, with the compensation for contribution, that can apply to non-farming heirs also. So I'm backing up here a little bit, but I said that on-farm heirs need to be compensated for their contribution, but also non-farming heirs may be contributing to something that preserves farm assets. So if the parents are being taken care of by someone that's not in the farm business, but they're coming down every day with meals or otherwise taking care of a parent that isn't being put into a nursing home, that can certainly be preservation of farm assets. And so if that's the case, then they need to be compensated as well. And, they're probably not doing it for financial reasons, of course. They're doing it because they love their parents and they want to take care of them. But nonetheless, what they're doing is preserving that business. And so keep track of those contributions as well, and have that as a consideration at least. Okay, so back to non-farming heirs in the business. If this is something that you want to do, then include provisions for management decision making, whether it's an LLC, a partnership, or a C corp. Within the bylaws or the articles of organization, you'll have, or however the shares are set up for a corporation, you'll have management separated by non-managing members or non-managing shares, non-voting shares. There's also provisions for monetary distributions or for providing a market for the shares of that non-farming heir. So essentially, what you don't want to do is lock the non-farming heir into a situation in which they're not getting any financial benefit of being part of the business, and there's no way for them to sell their shares to the farming heirs and get out of the business. And this actually happened last year. The Supreme Court addressed this in Bauer versus Bauer. The minority shareholder, the non-farming heir, brought a lawsuit against the farming heirs for minority shareholder oppression. Essentially what happened was the parents put the land into an S corp in, I believe, the 70s, perhaps early 80s. So they put the farm into a corporation. They put all of the heirs in there, with a few having the farming heirs having a majority of the shares and having management control. Well, what do? As the farm progresses, as they have profits, they pay themselves as employees and then put the rest of the profits back into the farm operation, getting new equipment, buying more land. But what they're not doing is paying dividends, so there's no financial benefit to the non-farming heir that's in the business. And there's also no way for the non-farming heir to sell their shares to the farming heirs, because there's no market there. It's a closed family corporation, and so the farming heirs basically can say, well, we'll buy you out, but it's going to be for a very reduced price. And there's basically nothing that the off-farm heir can say. So the Supreme Court of Iowa basically said that when you value those non-farming shares for sale to the farming heirs, there has to be a reasonable valuation process. They didn't say exactly what it was, but they cited a few other cases where it was particularly low, like 20% of the market value, something like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, that they have to pay fair market value, but it has to be reasonable. It remains to be seen what that is, but certainly somewhere between 20% and fair market value. Okay, so here's the other beginning farmer incentive programs. The first two are USDA programs. The CRP Transition Incentives Program, this is one where if there's a landowner or a retiring farmer with CRP land that's coming out, they can go ahead and enter into either a long-term lease of 5 years with a beginning farmer, or they can sell the land to a beginning farmer. The landowner then receives 2 additional CRP payments, and the beginning farmer, a year prior to the expiration of the CRP contract, can go ahead and start preparing the land for planting. The USDA Land Contract Program, so this is a program that guarantees land installment sale contract payments for a landowner that enters into an installment contract with a beginning farmer. Beginning farmer loan program. So this is where lenders as well as landowners that enter into contracts for sale with beginning farmers can receive a federal and state tax exemption on the interest income earned from that loan or installment sale contract. And the beginning farmer tax credit, we've talked about that already. That's 7% for cash rent and I believe 17% for crop share. And Luke has put the website up there for the Iowa Ag Development Division, which administers both the farm tax credit, the beginning farmer tax credit, and the beginning farmer loan program. And the website for CRP Transition Incentive Program.
Excellent. Let's switch over quick to the slides of our beginners and continue the discussion.
Okay, can you hear me, Luke?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is kind of our situation right now. A lot of our questions, Ed, I think you actually touched on, answered. There might be a few left that are still kind of outstanding. My parents own about 320 acres. They've been row cropping it for years now. They are getting to the point where they are wanting to slow down. They're not ready to stop farming, but they are ready to kind of scale down a little bit. And we are to the point where we really need to increase production in order to make our operation profitable for the labor that we're putting into it. And I do have one sibling. She's not involved on the farm, so that's kind of one more piece to the puzzle. This should really kind of be called our 2-week plan because that's really all we have under our belt at this point. We took a holistic management financial planning class in February, and they kind of have a series of questions that you're supposed to ask yourselves, and one of them is, what is your log jam? And when we came home, we kind of decided that our log jam was we have no idea what the plan is for the farm. So we went and talked to my folks and tried to get something kind of started trying to get a little bit of momentum because we just hadn't been able to make much progress in that way. And we want to thank Dan Wilson's family for their blog post on their family situation because that was kind of our icebreaker with my parents, and it helped a lot in getting some conversation started. So that was extremely helpful. So our rough plan right now is that Dave and I would buy half of the farm on private contract from my parents, and then they would turn their half into an FLP, and then they and us would hold shares in that FLP, and after their death, then their shares would be transferred to my sister, and then that would provide her with kind of an annual income that would, I guess, be her share of the inheritance, and then probably some other assets would transfer to her. So our questions, is it necessary to have the land appraised? Do you have to do that in order to determine what you're going to sell it for? Or is that something that you can kind of make up your own price?
And this is for me to answer, right, Luke? Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to, so, yeah, you can enter into a contract to sell at less than market value.
Okay.
And now, if it's drastically less than market value, that could raise red flags as far as capital gains tax. So with the IRS, they may look at that and say, oh, this is, they're trying to avoid capital gains, and so you might still have to pay some extra there. So that's an issue to look at. But certainly you can sell it for below market.
Okay. And then what did you say the number was for that? Did you say 20% of market value is that's the bottom, the floor, the minimum that you could do? Did I hear that right?
Oh, no, I didn't. I didn't mention. I don't know that there is a specific amount.
Okay. All right. And then one of our other questions was with all the machinery, the tractors, the all the implements and grain bins and buildings or maybe not buildings, but whatnot. Is there a way of transferring those from them to us through the FLP over several years as they slow down and we kind of scale up?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to do it. It could be a lease, it could be a purchase. I think, gifting is done a lot, particularly with equipment, and that would be done certainly over several years. There's anything below, anybody can make a gift for $14,000 or less each year to another individual without any type of gift tax. And then there's also about over a $5 million allowance for gifts that exceed that $14,000. So
Okay.
essentially, if you're doing it right, you can gift over time, and that'll be beneficial.
Okay. Since our businesses are so different from each other, theirs being row crop and ours being the beef and pork and whatnot, do you have any suggestions for how to do that, how to keep them separate within the FLP when they share equipment and facilities?
Yeah, I guess leases would be one way to do it, or some other type of contract. But just ensuring that all of the records are kept separate. But probably one business leasing from the other.
Okay. And until we kind of figure out what we're doing, and then even if we do follow through with this plan and form the FLP, how can we account for improvements that we're going to make to the land? Whether they be permanent fencing or building repairs or just increasing soil productivity or dealing with erosion.
Yep. Yeah, there's a number of ways you can do that, and the most important thing is what you've already recognized is that you need to account for it and to keep records of it, and this gets into the the compensation for the contribution that you've had to the farm business. The fencing and the building repairs, those types of things, keep records of those. Those are monetary things. Soil productivity and erosion, that's a little more difficult. So you'll have to come up with some way of putting a value on those things and some way of gauging them. And again, you can come up with a number of different ways to do that. It's really up to you, but just specifying what those are.
Okay. As far as putting a dollar value on interest within the FLP, is there any guidelines for that, or do you just kind of... I know that it's harder to put a value on them because those interests have to stay within the family and could not be sold to a non-family member. you have any advice on that?
Well, I would just say, to keep it reasonable. So this is kind of the situation with the Bauer case, and so don't devalue them so much that there's no uh, um, point in having them, I guess, or there's no value to the non-farming heirs. Is that kind of in relation to what you're talking about?
I think so. We were just trying to figure out if we split it up into shares. For the time being, it would just be Dave and I, and then my parents holding shares. And
Hmm.
part of my parents' shares would transfer to my sister upon their death. And we were just trying to figure out how do you even put a dollar amount on it, I guess. And that's something that we probably just need to keep thinking about and working through. And
Yeah, and so if the sister eventually wants to sell, then the idea here, as you stated, is that she has her inheritance through this method. And so
hmm
whether it's then she gets income from you guys leasing to the FLP, or buying it from land sell uh, through an installment contract, or whatever the case may be. But certainly it needs to be enough that she is treated fairly as well, and receives what the parents intended. Um,
okay.
this is kind of there's a question on there. Should we address that now?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Okay. I think the first part is for you. Is the sister interested in keeping the shares, or will she sell out to non-family?
That's kind of the reason why we decided that the FLP made the most sense because she would be unable to sell to a non-family member, and I think the way we would probably have it set up is that we would have right of refusal,
Hmm.
um, and at this point, I think she would be interested in keeping the shares, but if she down the road decided to change her mind, that would kind of be our safeguard
Yeah. And there's
against
a num
the
oh,
farm getting split up.
right, and that's important. There's a number of ways to do that, whether it's through a partnership or in an LLC. You can have buy-sell agreements. So if the sister decides, I want out, then um, either the uh, other members of the partnership or LLC have to buy out that interest, or it could be set up where the farm business actually purchases those shares or her interest. So yeah, the planning that you guys are doing is what's really critical there.
Okay. All right. And I think you covered that last question pretty well, as far as how to treat the non-farming family members. Unless there's anything that you would like to add.
No, I think we covered that pretty well. Unless anybody has questions on it.
Okay. Okay. And as far as our current situation with leases, we do have a written lease with our neighbor that we're renting the perennial pasture from. And as of up to this point, we've only had a verbal agreement with my parents. We are planning to have a written lease, but there's just a lot of stuff that we need to get figured out before we can get all the details in there. Um, we will be renting some crop ground from another neighbor, so we will, I guess, have to um, make a lease with him. And
Hmm.
then we have the neighbor who has the hog facilities that he is willing to rent it to us whenever we decide that we want to um, try and get into hogs on a bigger scale. So,
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting situation, leasing the hog buildings. So it might resemble more of a commercial lease, with buildings involved, and so certainly maintenance, replacement of the buildings, liability, insurance, all of those things are things that I would think would need to be addressed. That might not be in your typical farm lease.
Hi Ed, this is Dave. We got our lease form for the pasture from the Iowa State Ag Decision Maker, and it was just a kind of a form that we filled in. Is there something similar that we could use for the building if we're gonna use the lease for the hog facility?
There probably is. I don't know specifically where you would find one. It's probably out there. I've never come up with a sample lease or a form lease to distribute, um, just because I think they're a little bit dangerous in the sense that people will use those and not tailor them to their specific needs.
Okay.
So I would recommend, even if you do find a form lease or for that type of facility, certainly uh, take the opportunity to explore all of the variables within your specific situation, um, and address any unique attributes. And even if you use one of those and then tailor it a little bit, I would still go and talk to an attorney, because their job is to try to think of all of the things that can go wrong, and address those before they're an issue.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Our questions with the leases were, is there any way to encourage a current or prospective landlord to enter a long-term lease? And I don't, maybe there's not an answer to that, other than just trying to make your offer the most attractive. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's critical to really, basically talk to them as like they're a lender, because they're giving you a substantial, um, uh, they're giving you some credit there, and so presenting them with a resume, that's not too uncommon now. Maybe even a business plan, so that they understand your operation, especially if it's unique, something that they're not familiar with. That could be beneficial. And then we talked about the ways of adjusting rent, and so so that they're not locked in to a set amount, but that it can fluctuate with land values would be important, I think.
Okay. Yep, and that was kind of what the second question was, and I think you covered that well, unless anyone has any other questions pertaining to that. And I guess we had the same question with the leases as we did with farm succession, is how, well, I guess this one's a little bit different. As far as the improvements that you make being reflected in the rental rate, you covered that pretty well too. We'll hop to the next one. As far as improvements that we make on like this hog building, I am not sure if the water lines are still in working order. It needs a lot of work done to it. So I don't know if that would kind of fall under the same guidelines that you talked about with just renting farm ground in general, if buildings are any different, if it's specifically a building that you are renting.
Well, certainly there's more of a history, I think, with buildings, and like I said, in commercial leases, um, and how the buildings are maintained. If there's any type of catastrophe, how they're replaced. But really, I mean, it can be reflected in the rental rate if you want it to be. You can divvy up the cost for that within a table within the lease. You can do it however you want to do it. I would just, come up with reasonable values for those things, as well as if you're doing it yourself, valuing your labor, and then going from there as far as how you want to share those costs. But generally, long-term improvements, particularly with short-term leases, are something that the landowner or the landlord incurs, and short-term improvements are taken care of by the tenant.
Okay. All right. And then you also covered this, how to distinguish between temporary and long-term land or building improvements. The last one is what monitoring strategies or dialogues could help a lessee educate a landlord on how farming practices affect their land, and probably how it would affect their land in a good or bad way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, whether it's, soil testing, or having a history on land, if you're grazing a particular piece of land, having pictures of the land before and after, and what types of grasses are there, what type of wildlife is there, um, things like that, or just the stocking density that's available for the land that you're grazing. So all of those things can be indicators, and I would think could help educate a landowner.
Okay. All right. I think that's it for our questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we've got the what options are out there in Iowa for restrictive covenants and conservation easements if a landowner wants long-term protection from high input farming. Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I get fairly often. And easements, um, conservation easements, sometimes they can be agricultural easements. The basic idea there is that the purchaser of the easement is purchasing specific rights for that piece of land. So often that's development rights. It could be that the land is not going to be farmed, that it's going to be returned to its conservation value, whether it's prairie or a wetland, whatever. Now there's some, particularly on the coast, there's a fair number of easements that focus on agricultural preservation, and there are in the Midwest as well, but I think mostly in the Midwest it's just conservation easements, so they're not focused on farming, and they're certainly not focused on one particular type of farming. So to have a long-term easement, these are in perpetuity, so they last forever. That restricts the farming practices or types of farming is something that I just haven't seen a lot, and it raises a number of issues as far as changing technology and that type of thing. So talking about, he says these talking about keeping it in production but not limiting chemical applications. So that's more of a pure agricultural easement. So the idea is to just limit the development rights, keep it in agriculture. That's certainly something that can be done, and it's a matter of finding the entity that's going to purchase the easement or accept the easement as a donation and then monitor it going forward. There's also, right to farm laws, statutory protections. Let's see. I think we've got some more questions here. He also mentioned restrictive covenants. I'll just say really quickly that those are possible, but they'll need to be recorded every about 20 years or so. So these are covenants where you sell the land and you place restrictions on them, just like many neighborhoods have subdivisions. That's also a possibility, but probably not in perpetuity like an easement is. Can you force your landowner into your truck on your way to a field day to get educated? um, yeah, I'd like to make a couple jokes about this, but I probably shouldn't because somebody would take me up on it. But so I'll just say no, I wouldn't recommend that. But certainly encouraging them to be a part of PFI and take part of PFI's landowner program now, I think would certainly be beneficial. Okay, and then the last question is for Dave and Meg there.
Yeah, Dave, did you hear that? I mean, you might need to turn back on your microphone. There you go. Not hearing anything from Dave and Meg. Hmm. Ed, I guess I'll share a quick story until Dave and Meg are back online. That might help share, with other folks in the chat box too. But it's so easy for beginners. I fell victim to this totally in my life. You get an opportunity to use somebody's land for something, and to help them out, and you work together, but you don't have anything in writing, and then 4 years goes by, and you never got paid, and you have no say in what happens on that land, and stuff like that. Um, do you have any recommendations other than the standard, I told you so, don't do anything unless it's in writing?
Yeah, and I guess this is where those relationships come into play. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, when you don't have a strong bargaining position, um, that's difficult. I'm not sure, I guess, other than, one of the things that I didn't talk about is the importance of communication and, talking as frequently and often as you can. And, just building those relationships, I guess. And maybe I would add, um, you know, diversification never hurts as a risk management tool. So, we do that with, our crops and that type of thing. And so, hopefully land access can be another one of those.
Right on. The laws of power. All right, thanks, Grant. Dave and Meg, can you join us back on the microphone?
Oh, yep. I didn't realize that we had the mic off. I've got a comment on Luke's last question for us. Meg's parents have been really supportive of what we're trying to do, and it's been great working with them. And I think they understand why we graze the livestock the way we do and what we're trying to achieve as far as soil and forage productivity. But some of the other neighbors that we rent from, we don't know as well. And even on their land, we're still trying to move the cattle once a day or more, and it benefits us, we hope, in terms of increased forage utilization and maybe better productivity in the future as we improve the soil. But we have to decide how much effort to put into that land versus whether or not we want to kind of compromise the way we think we should manage that land too. And I'm sure we won't get any sort of rent benefit by doing what we think is taking better care of the land, but we don't necessarily want to graze it the way that conventional livestock producers would. So it's kind of tough to balance that.
Awesome. Dave and Meg, I wondered if you could tell us more about how you guys decided to start talking with your family about transition.
This farminar. It got the ball rolling, and it was great incentive to look into it more. It hadn't been real high priority because we were so busy just trying to get our production under control and just manage the enterprises that we had. So it started some good conversations, and that's kind of led to where we are now, which is great because I think they're excited. I think my dad was really kind of dreading having to figure any of this out because I don't think he's seen a solution. He just didn't know what options were out there, and I think it was kind of overwhelming to even think about trying to sort through them all. So since we kind of came alongside and provided some information and tried to get some meetings, some family meetings going where everyone kind of felt that they could talk and voice their concerns or their goals or whatever it might be. And that helped because then people started being more honest and the real issues kind of came to light, and then we could kind of all work through them together. So the Farminar started it, and holistic management helped a lot.
It did.
And yeah, so it's kind of grown from there.
It
So-
started out with a couple fairly formal family meetings where we had a rough agenda that we wanted to talk about, and we just kind of started with formalities, and it was pretty vague and inconclusive. And then Meg and I realized we were going to have to start asking some tough questions. So I didn't feel like it was my place as the in-law necessarily, but Meg started to sort of turn the screws a little bit and ask questions like, you know,
Thanks.
how long do you expect to keep farming full time? How long until you want to start phasing out? You know, what sort of lifestyle do you envision for retirement? And what kind of income do you need to retire the way you want? And that, once we sort of reached that line as far as asking those hard questions, then it was much easier for all of us to engage and continue to get into the details. So that was hard at first, but then it's going much more smoothly now.
That's just great. And all those questions you had, did you just come up with those on your own, or did you Google something and find a good list of questions to go on?
No, they were ours. And they were pretty specific to our own situation, but we just tried to learn about a few of the different options and talk them over together, and discard the ones that obviously didn't fit, and then look into the ones that we felt had some potential, and kind of went from there.
Can I add, Luke? I just wanted to comment on Ryan's comment there about the grazing lease. I don't think I mentioned that, but if you're doing rotational grazing or some type of grazing that improves the land, and then you can put more animals on it, so then you don't want to base it, you don't want to base your rent on the animal units because the farmer's losing any incentive there to improve the land and get more animals on there.
Excellent. Well, what do you think, Dave? Dave and Meg, can what you guys have done in the last 2 weeks be done by every beginner that's on this Farminar?
I would say one of the biggest helpful things that we did before we even started getting into the succession stuff was to write a business plan and write down our goals using the HM, the holistic management format. So once we kind of knew what our production targets were and what sort of profit margin we needed from an individual unit of production, then we knew what we needed to have for a land base, and that gave us a lot more clarity when we were talking with our parents. So I think, yeah, anybody can write a business plan. It takes a lot of work. So if you're willing to do the work,
Stick with it.
yep, it's possible.
Great. I'm going to put a link here to the Business Planning Resources Guide on our website for folks who have not worked on a business plan yet. there's one more minute left. If there's anybody with a burning question, you can post it here. Until that question comes up, I will take a moment to thank Ed and Dave and Meg for doing all this great prep work and sitting in on this Farminar together. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you, Ed, very much for all the help that you gave over email and phone and through the Farminar. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you, Luke, for having me.
Now, the next Farminar, I want to have your parents on, Meg. How about that?
Ha! Yeah, you talk to my dad about that. We'll see how far you get.
He doesn't like computers very much.
He's even worse than I am with computers.
Well done, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Farminar. It's been a great series. We'll see you again next fall. There's a lot of great summer events happening at the Practical Farmers of Iowa, so do enjoy. Avail yourself to our website regularly, and we'll see you at a...
All right. Thank you, Luke.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.